Hello, church. Thank you for joining me today. Today is Mother's Day, and so we're going to be taking a pause of the book of James, and we're going to be looking at four mothers and four moms in the Old Testament, really, and the lessons they've learned actually could apply to everyone. So our first is a woman who sought wisdom from Elijah, and this is 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 1 through 7. One day, the widow of a member of the group of prophets came to Elijah and cried out, "My husband who served you is dead, and you know how he feared the Lord. But now a creditor has come, threatening to take my 2 sons as slaves. What can I do to help you?" Elijah asked. "Tell me, what do you have in the house?" "Nothing at all, except a flask of olive oil," she replied. And Elijah said, "Borrow as many empty jars as you can from your friends and neighbors. Then go into your house with your sons and shut the door behind you. Pour olive oil from your flask into the jars, setting each one aside when it is filled." So she did as she was told. Her sons kept bringing jars to her, and she filled one after another. Soon every container was full to the brim. "Bring me another jar," she said to one of her sons. "There aren't any more," he told her. And then the oil stopped flowing. When she told the man of God what had happened, he said to her, "Now sell the olive oil and pay your debts, and you and your sons can live on what is left over." Here's the story of a widow whose husband, the son of the prophets who had served under Elijah, he passed away, leaving her with no money. The law prohibited her from declaring bankruptcy, so that left her with no options but to offer her sons as payment for their debt. Now, she did seek wisdom from God through the prophet Elijah. She went to ask, but her expectations from God for God's provision was really limited. When Elijah asked in verse 2, what do you have in the house? She responded, "Nothing. I have nothing except a jar of oil." But a jar of oil is more than enough for God. Elijah's question is a good one for not only mothers, but all who trust in God. What do you already have that God can use? When the widow did what Elijah asked, God provided for her needs from what she already had. This oil was enough for God to multiply so she could pay off her debt and then live off of it, live off of what she sold all the oil. So the main point, whatever you have is enough for God to use for his good purpose. And now there's a mother whose choice impacted generations. Hebrews chapter 11, 23 through 27. It was by faith that Moses' parents hid him for 3 months when he was born. They saw that God had given them an unusual child, and they were not afraid to disobey the king's commands. It was by faith that Moses, when he grew up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to share the oppression of God's people instead of enjoying the fleeting pleasures of sin. He thought it was better to suffer for the sake of Christ than to own the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to his great reward. It was by faith that Moses left the land of Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He kept right on going because he kept his eyes on the one who is invisible. In verse 23, it says that by faith, Jochebed, that's Moses' mom's name, she hid her son for 3 months. Now, after Jochebed protected her son by sending him down the Nile in a basket where he was found by the king's daughters, Jochebed was asked to be Moses' wet nurse, to nurse the baby. And during that time, as Jochebed had Moses, she passed her trust and faith in God to her son. Verse 24, it was by faith that Moses, when he grew up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Verse 27, It was by faith that Moses left the land of Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He kept right on going because he kept his eyes on the one who is invisible. Jochebed's decision to stay strong in her faith impacted her son, who later led Israel out of Egypt. It's an example for not just mothers, but all parents, whether biological parents, adopted, or those called to be spiritual parents to kids and to young adults. The example is the impact that quiet faithfulness can have on the lives of many. The main point, we have the opportunity to impart our faith to others, which can potentially impact generations. Another story of a mom, it's a woman who kept her promise in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 1 through 28. Hannah was not able to have children. She continued to ask God to give her a son. Now, one evening while she was sitting at the door of the temple in Shiloh, she made a vow to God. 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 9 through 11. Once after a sacrificial meal at Shiloh, Hannah got up and went to pray. Eli the priest was sitting at his customary place beside the entrance of the tabernacle. Hannah was in deep anguish, crying bitterly as she prayed to the Lord. And she made this vow. O Lord of heaven's armies, if you will look upon my sorrow and answer my prayer and give me a son, then I will give him back to you. He will be yours for his entire lifetime. And as a sign that he has been dedicated to the Lord, his hair will never be cut. God heard her prayer and granted her request. And soon Samuel was born. Now, really, Samuel, his name means, I have asked for him from the Lord. How easy it would have been for Hannah to forget her promise to God and hold Samuel tight and raise him to adulthood as her child, which he is. Like any other mother, she would have been deeply attached to her son, especially a baby that she didn't even know she could have. Yet Hannah kept her word. Rather than pretending she never said it, she affirmed her commitment and acknowledged God's faithfulness. 1 Samuel chapter 1, 24 through 28. When the child was weaned, Hannah took him to the tabernacle in Shiloh. They brought along a 3-year-old bull for the sacrifice and a basket of flour and some wine. After sacrificing the bull, they brought the boy to Eli. Sir, do you remember me? Hannah asked. I am the very woman who stood here several years ago praying to the Lord. I asked the Lord to give me this boy, and he has granted my request. Now I am giving him to the Lord, and he will belong to the Lord his whole life. And they worshiped the Lord there. Samuel grew in competence, found favor with the Lord, and was eventually confirmed as a prophet of God and a judge who would anoint Israel's first and second king, Saul and then David. The main point, we can't always see what God is doing behind the scenes when we surrender our lives to him. And then our last mom in the Old Testament that we're going to be looking at, a widow who provided for Elijah. 1 Kings 17, verses 8 through 16. Then the Lord said to Elijah, go and live in the village of Zarephath, near the city of Sidon. I have instructed a widow there to feed you. So he went to Zarephath. As he arrived at the gates of the village, he saw a widow gathering sticks, and he asked her, would you please bring me a little water in a cup? As she was going to get it, he called to her, bring me a bite of bread too. But she said, I swear by the Lord your God that I don't have a single piece of bread in the house. And I have only a handful of flour left in the jar and a little cooking oil in the bottom of the jug. I was just gathering a few sticks to cook this last meal, and then my son and I will die. But Elijah said to her, don't be afraid. Go ahead and do just what you've said, but make a little bread for me first. Then use what's left to prepare a meal for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. There will always be flour and olive oil left in your containers until the time when the Lord sends rain and the crops grow again. So she did as Elijah said, and she and Elijah and her family continued to eat for many days. There was always enough flour and olive oil left in the containers, just as the Lord had promised through Elijah. God tells Elijah, who was fleeing from the wicked King Ahab, to stay with a widow in Zarephath. And really, a drought has been on the land for 3.5 years, and it has caused a famine. The woman was gathering sticks so that she could prepare the last handful of flour she had left for herself and her son, in the way that she says it, so that we may eat it and die. So in her desperate situation, she focused on the little she had instead of what God might provide. Elijah commands the woman to make him some bread. Now, his request for food and water during a famine likely put this non-Jewish, financially challenged woman in an awkward position. Despite her fear and distress, the woman believed the Lord's promise and trusted him when Elijah said, "Do not fear." The flour was never used up, and the jar of oil never ran dry. God honored the woman's obedience in a very grim situation. It's really a lesson for all of us. The main point, Jesus' grace is sufficient for all. I want to say to all moms everywhere and throughout all generations, thank you for putting up with your kids. Our takeaways from these 4 moms: whatever you have is enough for God to use for His good purpose. We have the opportunity to impart our faith to others, which can potentially impact generations to come. We can't always see what God is doing behind the scenes when we surrender our lives to Him. And then finally, this is something that we can hang our hats on. Jesus' grace is sufficient for all. Happy Mother's Day.